Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel. I'm Bird's Eye View Politics, and in this video we're going to continue taking a bird's eye view look at the Russo-Ukrainian war. So first, let's get into the recent news, which is that not only have the Leopard tanks arrived in Ukraine, or at least most of them, but also that now the Ukrainian military is going to start training on how to fire, maneuver, use these tanks on Monday. So these will likely come into effect sometime in the next few months after the Ukrainians who are going to be in these tanks are able to use them. These tanks are a huge victory for Ukraine to get because they are very good not only offensively but also defensively, because cannons, of course, have been very effective. Artillery has been very effective in the war so far. So a moving cannon or a moving artillery is going to be even more effective, and that is what the Ukrainians hope to get from these tanks. Now, something important to note is tanks aren't only defensive, as I mentioned, or offensive, but they can go both ways. For example, we have heard many rumors, and increasingly Ukraine and the United States are beginning to confirm that Russia plans to make some sort of attack between Zaporizhia in the west and Donetsk in the east. So along this front, probably to retake the rest of Zaporizhia and maybe some of southwestern or western Donetsk, but also maybe to even get further up into the Dnipro area right here, which is mostly plains area, so it is very good for offensive warfare. However, tanks, as I mentioned, are good for defensive warfare as well, so Ukraine will be able to fight back here. Additionally, if Ukraine wants to make offensives or counterattacks in the region, as well as further to the northeast in the main front line near Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, then they can do that as well. So, of course, these are major benefits for Ukraine from these tanks. Additionally, we also had, of course, continued Russian airstrikes. This is yesterday, but there's been more today. As we go through, you can see. But clearly, all these blue circles right here, these are red alert markers on live map, which show that Russia is launching airstrikes in these cities, in these areas, sometimes on military targets, but way too often on civilian targets as well. And they can be either very far from the front line, such as what we saw over here in western Ukraine, even near Lviv, and even towards the Slovakian border, which is way out here, but also down in Kherson, which is right on the front line. There's also been some limited Ukrainian attacks, such as right here across the river. Ukraine still wants to take this key hydroelectric power plant. However, that has not happened yet. So Ukraine is going to continue making small movements in this area. Russia, of course, still bombing the front line. And there's a bridge here as well that had previously been blown up by Russia, but Ukraine is likely going to attempt to make an assault in this region relatively soon, although of course we're all going to have to wait to see what happens from the new offensive front line right here. And as you can see, Russia is beginning to prepare this offensive. They've got a lot of aerial attacks and artillery attacks in the region, which hasn't really happened, nowhere near at least the same level as we've seen in Donetsk and Luhansk, the main theater of fighting, which still has had its fair share of artillery duels and small-scale attacks. But of course, as we can see from these dots, there's still a lot of fighting here, but we're increasingly seeing this theater right here gain more and more attention from nations around the globe, and also from local Ukrainian and Russian commanders. Something else to note, however, across the world is the United States and much of their allies in the Western Hemisphere. I'm talking about Colombia. We're talking about Costa Rica. We can continue on and on. There was a spy balloon that China sent up that was put up clearly to spy on the United States, specifically targeting their military equipment centers, likely just looking to gain general information about the preparedness of the United States military. Why would they do this? Now, there's not a very good answer, because conventional knowledge would say that China doesn't want a war with the United States. They're still very dependent on the United States for energy. They're dependent on the United States for food supply, especially. If China was to go to war with the U.S., China would see not only a severe recession and almost an economic collapse, if not a full-on economic depression, but also they would have famine, and there'd be many other consequences of any attack. However, as we saw with Russia, sometimes people are willing to go to extreme measures to achieve personal goals, and it is very clear that President Xi of China has a personal goal to get Taiwan back into the mainland of China and under communist government. Taiwan, of course, itself is still not in favor of this, and pro-independence parties have been winning for a fairly sustained period of time, and that looks to be holding steady as we head into the Taiwan elections, especially after the recent referendum, which I'll cover in a video maybe sometime later this month. Now, this spy balloon not only shows that China is clearly trying to upset the international pro-Western order, as many people would call it, but also they're testing the waters. They're preparing to see what is the United States going to do, because, as we know, the Republicans took control of the House of Representatives, which is mostly in charge of money. That's the most important feature, or I guess part of the House of Representatives, is they are the ones who get to start any bills that have to do with funding. And funding can include military funding, of course, which would include any aid to Taiwan, military, etc. Now, if the United States has just been sending tanks to Ukraine, and those, of course, cost a lot of money, and they've also been sending, of course, anti-aircraft weapons, they've given huge amounts of economic aid, then is the United States going to aid Taiwan as well? And that's something that we don't know. However, there is a growing consensus from the Western countries that these tanks, as well as other armaments given to Ukraine, are only going to be used to defend Ukraine, and they probably would not end up ever deployed on Russian territory, which brings us to the Crimea. Now, as we know, Crimea was taken by Russia way back in 2014, and we really haven't known what role it's going to play in the war. It was the scene of an early offensive back in February and even into March of that 2022 invasion. However, since then, there has been very little done in Crimea other than one bridge being blown up, which I made a video on quite a while ago when it happened, and that was big news because it meant that Ukraine was going to use their new capabilities and armaments given by the West to fight back not only in the newly occupied territories of Ukraine, such as Melitopol or Kherson, or earlier in the war in the northeast in Sumy, etc. They're also going to use it to fight back to take the pre-2014 borders, which includes South Luhansk and Southeast Donetsk, as well as potentially Crimea. And so these tanks are going to be a major offensive weapon for Ukraine if they ever decide to go through the plains, the farmland that is in Kherson and Melitopol Oblast, and even into Crimea. So, what do you think will happen next? Don't forget to comment, like, and share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.